The honourable member for Elmwood, Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It might just help to kind of step back and mention for a minute what it is that we're here to talk about. And really what we're here to talk about is how it is that the government intends to implement and enforce the very same rules that the Prime Minister sent out to his ministers when he appointed the Cabinet. Now, we've heard from some Liberal members that, you know, somehow they don't think that putting it in the law is the best way. If they have an alternative, let's hear it. But right now, we've got a situation where ministers of the Crown are obviously not following the rules set out by the Prime Minister. So if the Liberals have a great idea on how to see that policy actually enforced, let's hear it. In the meantime, writing those rules into the law and allowing the Conflict of Interest Commissioner to enforce those rules seems like a pretty good idea, Mr. Speaker, and we certainly haven't heard anything better from members opposite today. To give you a sense of what those rules are, Mr. Speaker, maybe we step back and say something about the context into which the new government stepped in October, and you really just have to name some names in order to get a sense of where Canadians were feeling about the standard of ethics in politics last October, October 2015, when we were talking about Dean Del Maestro, we were talking about Mike Duffy. There were a lot of names on the tips of the tongues of Canadians that suggested to them that the ethical standard in Canadian politics wasn't high enough. And in came the Prime Minister, if you listen to him, on a white horse, and he was going to make things better. He went so far as to say in his instructions to ministers, moreover, ministers have an obligation to perform their official duties and arrange their private affairs in a manner that will bear the closest public scrutiny. This obligation is not fully discharged merely by acting within the law. He went on in Annex B of that same document to give some more flesh to what exactly he meant, or to flesh out what he meant. He said, in order to ensure that there's no differential treatment or appearance, and that's really the crux of the matter, Mr. Speaker, because it's not just whether there's differential treatment. According to the Prime Minister, the issue is whether there may even be the appearance of differential treatment, and he himself said, as I quoted just now, that merely acting within the law would not be enough to meet the bar he was setting just over a year ago. So he says, in order to ensure that there's no differential treatment or appearance of differential treatment for individuals, corporations, or organizations because of their financial support of politicians or political parties, ministers and parliamentary secretaries should adopt the following best practices. What are those best practices that this motion simply calls on the government to enforce by allowing the Conflict of Interest Commissioner to enforce? Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, it says that ministers and parliamentary secretaries should not seek to have departmental stakeholders included in fundraising or campaign teams or on the boards of electoral district associations. So when we hear that the chair of Apotex is organizing a fundraiser for ministers of the Crown, I think that's a pretty obvious contradiction of the guidelines that the Prime Minister set out and that we're simply asking to have enforced, Mr. Speaker. It says that ministers and parliamentary secretaries should ensure that the solicitation of political contributions on their behalf does not target departmental stakeholders or other lobbyists and employees of lobbying firms. So when we find out through the Globe and Mail and others that there's been confidential websites set up and that people are getting access to those websites to buy tickets to those fundraisers by invitation, that's clearly not meeting the standards set out by the Prime Minister in these guidelines. And it makes you wonder, well, if the Prime Minister is not willing to police his members, who would? The Conflict of Interest Commissioner is an obvious choice, and this motion simply calls on the government to allow the Conflict of Interest Commissioner to go ahead and do that work that the Prime Minister has decided he won't do, because he's not enforcing his own rules. So as I say, Mr. Speaker, at any time Liberals want to chime up and say that they've got a better mechanism to ensure that this document and instructions on open and accountable government are actually followed by ministers of the Crown and not just talked about, let them put them on the table, Mr. Speaker, but we haven't heard anything from them, and we've been debating this all day. So the other notorious thing about what's going on, in my view, Mr. Speaker, about these particular fundraisers is we have talked about, and because it's a problem, because it does create the appearance of preferential access when people are paying $1,500 to get into an exclusive night with the finance minister. And incidentally, Mr. Speaker, the idea that somehow that a little old lady from Elmwood, Transcona, who takes handy transit to sit in the back of an open house and leaves without talking to the minister is the same as a high-powered corporate executive paying $1,500 to get into someone's private residence with only 14 other people is the same, and that there's clearly no difference in that interaction with the minister is laughable. And shame on the members who have been getting up today to insinuate that somehow those two situations are not significantly different for the purposes of influencing ministers, Mr. Speaker. That's just totally ridiculous. And then when they pay that $1,500, Mr. Speaker, to get into that privileged night with the minister as advertised, then what? Well, at tax time, they get about $650 of that back. So that's really nice. If you've got the $1,500 to fork out now, this is a cash flow issue, right? You get the $1,500 now, well then you get the preferential access. But the very same people who didn't have the $1,500 are the ones that are going to pay almost half of it back to you later. And so Canadians perversely are being made to pay for preferential treatment for high-powered corporate executives. And I think there's something shameful about that, Mr. Speaker, and hasn't gotten enough attention. They're not actually paying $1,500 out of their own pocket. They're paying about $800 out of their own pocket, and the rest is coming out of the pocket of Canadian taxpayers. And what we've heard, kind of as a defense, I guess, of this, Mr. Speaker, I referred earlier to Dean Del Maestro and Mike Duffy, and the government's defense of this seems to be, well, we're not like Dean Del Maestro, we're more of a Mike Duffy. Right? I mean, Duffy went through court and it ended up that he didn't break any rules according to the law. We have that from a judge, right? And so there was no problem. So Dean Del Maestro is bad. He went to jail, but there's no problem. We're really just like Mike Duffy, Mr. Speaker. So they've got the kind of strange Duffy defense. And I'll tell you, given the last 5 years of Canadian politics, for the government to get up and think that an acceptable defense is, don't worry, we're just like Mike Duffy, I think is pretty pathetic, Mr. Speaker. But that's what we've been hearing all day. So I'm at a loss for that, Mr. Speaker. And I think one of the other elephants in the room here, and actually one of the Liberal members earlier raised it as a bad thing, but I've always believed in a per vote subsidy for political financing. That came in when the under the Chrétien Liberals, Mr. Speaker. When they said that corporations and unions wouldn't be able to donate, they recognized that political parties were going to have a harder time raising money. And so they brought in public financing so that based on the support that a political party has, they could expect to have some money in order to fund their activities, and so that parties wouldn't be in a position where they were prostituting their ministers of the Crown for money. Because when you create that kind of imperative to have politicians spending all their time raising money, certain governments get into political hot water because they start to use all the tools at their disposal to raise that money, whether it's right or wrong. And that's what we've been watching. And I dare say that if they put their focus on bringing back a reasonable public support for political party financing, then they may not have to be in the embarrassing position of having to defend ministers that are doing cash for access fundraisers, Mr. Speaker. So that is, as far as I'm concerned, part of the debate. That's where it ought to go. I think it's an embarrassment to Canadians that ministers are out parading around asking for money for attention. I think, frankly, if they're not ashamed of it, Mr. Speaker, I think it's an embarrassment to the Liberal Party, and I think they should care more, frankly, for their own brand. It's an embarrassment to Canada. It's an embarrassment to the Liberals that they're out doing this. And if they brought in a proper political financing regime in Canada, one that we had. So what we're hearing from Liberals when they attack the political financing model is that they think that Stephen Harper and the reforms that Stephen Harper brought to political financing in Canada were better than Jean Chrétien. And if that's what they think, let's have them get up and say it again. That they're on Team Harper when it comes to electoral reform and they're disowning the actions of previous Liberal governments. And that if they had to choose between Stephen Harper's electoral reforms, yeah, there's some humor in that. Anyway, reforms or the Chrétien Liberal reforms, they'd be voting for the Harper reforms. Is that how far we've come? Is that what the last election was about? I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd really like to thank my NDP colleague. He lost me in the last minute, but that's okay. But the majority of the things I absolutely do agree with. We see investors that are going to speak to the finance minister for $1,500. We see natural resource stakeholders going to speak to the natural resource minister. I just want to know, am I dumb, or do you think they're speaking about gardening and about what book they're reading, or do you think they're actually talking about the topics that are dearest to their heart?
For Elmwood, Transcona.
Well, I mean, this harkens back to the defense of the Justice Minister, who was actually one of the first to engage in these unsavory fundraisers. I'm using now the language of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, who went to a fundraiser with a bunch of high-powered lawyers in Toronto, and then when questioned on it said, "Oh, I'm just here as an MP from Vancouver." That's all. They were just really excited to meet an MP from Vancouver, so there's no problem. And you're quite right. It is ridiculous to maintain that a bunch of high-priced Toronto lawyers wanted to meet the Minister of Justice simply in her capacity as an MP for Toronto. I don't think they're in the practice of having MPs show up regularly at their firm, pay them lots of money just to chit-chat about how things are going in their riding or what the weather is like or whatever else. And it is. It's laughable. It's laughable, but it's been going on for months now. And so you're absolutely right. It's just not credible to think that that's what's going on. And as I say, I mean, so the idea that someone showing up in the back of a free town hall versus someone paying big money to go to a private dinner, that somehow that's equal access to government it's just as ridiculous.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, wasn't that long ago when there was a New Democratic member of Parliament that said, "Give me $50 and I'll mention your name inside the House of Commons"? You know, Mr. Speaker, when you take a look at it, we have two political parties, both the New Democrats and the Conservatives, that have actually broken election laws. While I sat in opposition, they were actually breaking the election finances laws. Mr. Speaker, no election laws have been broken here. There is no conflict of interest if there is no laws that have actually been broken. And my question to the member is, does he not recognize that it's somewhat hypocritical for two political parties to be calling for something when they are the two parties that broke the law and have been ordered to return money by courts and by Elections Canada, whereas this government has not, Mr. Speaker? So if there is no election laws that are in fact being broken, there is no conflict. Will the member at least maybe apologize for his party's behaviour in breaking the election laws?
Honourable member for Elmwood, Transcona.
For those keeping score at home, Mr. Speaker, that's another instance of the Duffy Defence.
Questions and comments. The Honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's been interesting to listen to the comments from the Liberal side of the House today and it appears that as we cut closer to the chase, the louder the wails and screams seem to be. And I've noticed that quite often from the members opposite today. They really haven't come back with a good answer as to why they can't go along with this bill or this motion. And I'd like to ask the member that just is up speaking right now with his debate, what is this about? Again, it's not the laws. It's about the ethics and the appearance of conflict of interest. Could you reinforce that back to the members on the other side who have continuously distracted from what this motion is really about? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Elmwood, Transcona.
Well, thank you. I'd be happy to reinforce that at length, even. And I think you're quite right. And an important point is that standard of ethics and appearance of conflict of interest doesn't come from just this side of the House. That comes from the Prime Minister himself. And it didn't come in a footnote or scribbled on the back of a napkin. It came in a huge document that was released with great fanfare, and it was repeated many times that this was part of the instructions to ministers. And all that the motion today is really about is, how is it that the government is going to enforce those very same rules that the Prime Minister made such a big show of putting on his ministers and subjecting his ministers to? And the fact of the matter is, as these fundraisers continue, we see that there is no mechanism. Now, maybe there are other mechanisms, but the one suggested today is perfectly reasonable. We already have a conflict of interest commissioner. We already have the rules laid out by the Prime Minister, so just let the conflict of interest commissioner enforce the rules, and you can solve the problem.
Resuming debate, the honourable member